Welcome back to the Adult Sleep Story Company. Tonight, we leave the waking world behind and journey deep into the hills of Kentucky. In the early spring of 1937, Kentucky was waking slowly from winter, and the hills along the river were beginning to show the first soft signs of green. The sycamores still held themselves pale and bare against the sky, but low in the hollows the earth had loosened, and the scent of damp clay, leaf mold, and early blossom moved through the cool morning air. Across the country, the long years of the Depression had left their marks in empty pockets, patched roofs, and careful meals. Yet, in small towns and mountain communities, there remained a steady habit of endurance, the kind that did not call attention to itself. People rose early, mended what could be mended, shared what could be spared, and looked for usefulness wherever it appeared. It was in those years that the Works Progress Administration, part of President Roosevelt's New Deal, sent work into places where work was badly needed. Roads were laid, schools repaired, murals painted, songs collected, histories written down. And in the Appalachian counties of Kentucky, books began to travel by horse and mule over ridges and through creek beds to homes that had never known a public library. The Packhorse Library had already become one of the quiet wonders of that effort, carried largely by women who knew the mountain paths and the weather. Women with saddlebags full of stories, farm bulletins, children's primers, magazines, hymnals, and worn novels passed from hand to hand. Along the river systems, where roads were scarce and bends of water joined settlements more naturally than tracks over land, the same idea took on another shape. A library could float. Cora Baines had thought about that phrase often during the weeks before departure. A floating library. It sounded almost fanciful, something from a children's tale, until she looked at the lists, the river maps, the parcels of donated books, the stamped cards, the fresh ledger, and the little launch her brother Eli had been helping to make ready at the landing below Lexington. Then it became practical, and because it was practical, Cora trusted it. She was fond of beautiful ideas, but only when they could be folded into a satchel, entered in ink, tied down against weather, and delivered where they were needed. Before dawn, in the small room she rented near the edge of Lexington, Cora stood beside her narrow bed and checked the contents of her bag for the third time. A change of stockings, a wool cardigan, 2 handkerchiefs, a tin of tea, a packet of biscuits wrapped in paper, and the small brown volume of poems her mother had given her when she first left home. Her librarian's satchel was heavier. In it lay the new logbook, its first pages still stiff and clean. A stack of borrower cards, pencils sharpened carefully with a penknife, a rubber stamp, envelopes, string, and a folded route sheet showing the first stretch of the Kentucky River. Its bends drawn in blue pencil, where Eli had marked shallow places and friendly landings. On the table beneath the window lay the books she had chosen to keep close for the first day. There were 2 children's readers with frayed red covers, a household guide with recipes and remedies in a plain, sensible hand, a book on poultry keeping, one on vegetable gardens, a worn copy of the Bible, and 3 novels whose pages had softened from being read many times before. Cora had entered each title in her catalog the previous evening, writing slowly so that every letter sat clear and even. She liked the order of it, the feeling that every book had a place, and every place might soon have a reader. The city outside was not yet awake. A milk cart rattled somewhere beyond the corner. A dog barked once, then settled. Lexington in the blue hour held its breath, its brick fronts and bare trees softened by mist, its pavements dark from the night's coolness. Cora locked her door, tested the handle, then walked down the stairs with her satchel against her hip and her traveling bag in one hand. The air smelt of wet stone, horse, chimney smoke, and the faint sweetness of buds opening on branches. By the time she reached the street, a pale line of gold had begun to gather in the east. The road to the river landing was quiet enough for her footsteps to sound distinct. She passed shuttered shop windows, a church with its notice board still silvered by dew, and a row of houses where lamps glowed low behind curtains. Somewhere, a woman was already sweeping a porch. Somewhere else, bacon had begun to hiss in a pan. Cora felt the familiar small tightness beneath her ribs that came before any new undertaking. But she did not mistake it for doubt. It was only the body's way of noticing that life was changing. Eli was at the landing before her, as she had known he would be. He stood on the weathered gray dock with one boot on a coil of rope, his cap pushed back and his sleeves rolled above his wrists despite the morning chill. Beside him, riding low and neat against the pilings, was the boat. It was not grand. It had none of the proud height of a packet boat, none of the ornamental trim that might have made strangers pause to admire it. It was modest, square-cabined and sturdily built, with fresh paint along the sides, and a small sign near the door that read, "Floating Library," in clean black letters. "You're early," Eli said. "So are you." "That's different. I had to make certain she hadn't floated off without us." Cora smiled, and the tightness beneath her ribs eased at once. Eli had always moved easily around water. As a boy, he had known which stones were slick, where a current changed color, how a rope should be looped so that it held without quarreling. Now he stepped from dock to deck with the same unthinking balance, taking her bag, setting it down under the cabin awning, checking a line with one hand while he spoke over his shoulder. The river moved beneath them, wide and slow, carrying a faint green light from the morning sky. On either side, the Kentucky hills rose in long folded shapes, still shadowed at their bases, their upper trees touched with the first warmth of day. Inside, the boat was smaller than Cora had imagined, and more perfect than she had hoped. The ceiling was low enough to make the cabin feel held and intimate. Warm timber lined the walls, still smelling faintly of sawdust and fresh varnish. And shelves ran along both sides, fitted with narrow rails to keep the books from sliding when the wake of another boat passed, or the river turned uneasy after rain. Eli had built the shelves himself, using boards planed smooth but not polished beyond their nature. Their grain showed like quiet watermarks beneath Cora's hand. The books were already waiting in stacked crates. Together, they began to place them. Fiction to the left, where the light from the side window fell best in the afternoon. Farming, livestock, and home remedies to the right, nearest the door, for those who would come in quickly between chores. Children's primers and picture books on the lower shelf, where small hands could reach. The Bible and hymnals together, not because Cora wished to prescribe their use, but because she knew they would be asked for often. Magazines and stitched scrapbooks went in a wooden box beneath the desk, each one made from clippings that other libraries had saved. Dress patterns, seed advice, current events, recipes, poems, cartoons, and instructions for mending a kettle or soothing a cough. At the far end of the cabin, beneath a single lamp, stood the small desk that was to be Cora's. She placed the logbook there, then the catalog cards in their narrow tray. Her handwriting looked very formal in the new light, as though the cards belonged to a larger, older institution, rather than to this floating room with its fresh shelves and its smell of timber, river air, paper, and engine oil. The water outside sent pale reflections through the window. They trembled across the ceiling in slow, wavering bands, so that the whole cabin seemed gently breathing. "You've made her handsome," Cora said. "Useful," Eli replied, though he looked pleased. "Handsome is extra." When the last crate had been emptied and the last shelf checked, Eli went aft to the engine. It coughed once, then twice, before settling into a low, steady note that seemed to pass up through the boards into Cora's feet. The mooring line slipped free. The dock shifted away by inches. Lexington, or the edge of it, began to recede behind them. The landing, the warehouses, the thin morning smoke. The few figures who had paused to watch a little library take to the river. Cora stood at the cabin door, one hand on the frame, and watched the water open ahead. The Kentucky River had shaped much of the country through which it moved, cutting past limestone bluffs, turning beneath wooded slopes, carrying timber, tobacco, coal, gossip, letters, flour, grief, and weather from one bend to another. Long before motor roads reached the more difficult places, the river had been a kind of road itself, patient and changeable, joining communities that might otherwise have felt hidden from the world. In spring, it had a color like pale green glass where the sky entered it, and darker olive in the shadow of the banks. The boat moved without hurry, and the sound of the engine became part of the morning, no louder than a thought repeated steadily. Cora remained outside until the town had disappeared behind a bend and the hills took them in. The tree line was still mostly brown and gray, but color had begun to show in hints. Willow green along the low places, redbud haze in the woods, the white smoke of serviceberry blossoms on the slopes. A great blue heron lifted from the bank ahead, folding itself into the air with slow, deliberate wings. Once, in a clearing near the water, Cora saw 2 deer drinking, their heads rising as the boat passed, ears turned towards the quiet disturbance, bodies still as carved wood, until the trees received them again. Eli steered with one hand resting lightly on the wheel, reading the river as if it were a page printed in a language he had known all his life. He pointed out a sandbar, a snag caught below the surface, a cliff face where swallows would nest later in the year. Cora listened, and between his words, she heard the slap of water against the hull, the creak of timber, the occasional call of a bird hidden in the branches. The rhythm entered her gradually. There was work ahead, but not the kind that rushed. The day would come to them, one landing at a time. By late morning, the first landing appeared ahead, tucked into a bend where the bank rose in a long slope from the water. There was a worn wooden dock, a path climbing through grass and red clay, and above it, a small general store with a porch, a screen door, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Callaway's." A few outbuildings stood nearby, their roofs silvered by age. Smoke thinned from a chimney behind the store, and a line of washing moved faintly in the breeze. Ruth Callaway was already outside, standing at the head of the path with one hand shading her eyes, watching the boat come in as if she had been expecting it since sunrise. She came down before they had fully tied up, firm-footed on the path, her apron pinned neatly and her graying hair drawn back in a knot. Eli tossed the line, and Ruth caught it with a competence that made him grin. She looped it round the post, pulled once to test it, then looked up at Cora. "You'll be Miss Baines," she said, "and this will be what everyone's been asking about." "Cora, please," Cora replied, stepping ashore for the first time with the satchel strap across her shoulder. The dock shifted gently beneath her, and for a moment she felt the river's movement continue inside her, even on solid boards. Ruth's handshake was warm and dry. "Then I'm Ruth. I put word out after church and at the store. Didn't promise anything except that you'd come if the river let you." The store above the bank smelt of coffee, dry goods, lamp oil, apples kept too long in a barrel, and wood smoke lingering in the boards. Ruth had cleared a little space on the porch for anyone waiting, but the library opened without ceremony. At first, there were only 3 people. A boy in patched overalls, who stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the boat as if it might vanish if approached too quickly. An older woman who asked whether there were any new quilt patterns, and a young mother with a baby asleep against her shoulder, hoping for something her 2 older children could read aloud in the evenings. Cora brought them aboard one at a time, speaking softly, giving the cabin room to work its own persuasion. Then more came. Word moved faster than feet in a small place, and by noon the path held neighbors, cousins, children, 2 farmers who had meant only to look and stayed to ask about crop rotation, and a shy girl with a slate under her arm who touched the spine of a geography book as tenderly as if it were silk. They arrived cautious, curious, and quietly hopeful, bringing the reserve of people who had learned not to expect much, and the hunger of people who knew exactly what a book might mean when winter was long, roads were poor, and news from beyond the hills came late or not at all. Cora found herself settling into the work as though she had been doing it for years. She listened before she offered anything. To the boy, who admitted in a whisper that he liked engines, she gave a magazine with diagrams of machinery, and a reader simple enough to follow, but not so simple as to insult him. To the older woman, she found a scrapbook of patterns and a novel with a quiet courtship tucked inside its weathered cover. For the young mother, she chose 2 primers and a book of animal tales, showing her how to mark the borrower card and when the boat would return. Each entry went into the log in Cora's careful hand. Name, title, date, landing. The cabin filled and emptied, never crowded for long, always breathing with the river light. Children crouched by the low shelf, heads bent close together. Men removed their hats before stepping inside, not from any rule, but from instinct, as if entering a place where care had been taken. Ruth stood near the door when she was not fetching coffee from the store, directing people with brisk kindness, reminding one child to wipe his boots and another to let his grandmother choose first. Eli remained mostly outside, answering questions about the boat, tightening a line that did not need tightening, and watching Cora with the satisfied look of someone seeing a plan become real. In the afternoon, when the sun had moved west and the porch shadows stretched across the path, the visit began to draw naturally to a close. No one hurried. A farmer turned the pages of an almanac once more before tucking it beneath his arm. The shy girl returned to ask whether the geography book could truly be taken home, and Cora told her yes, if she promised to bring it back for someone else. Ruth wrote down the names of 2 families farther up the creek who could not come that day, and Cora promised to set aside suitable books for them next time. The promise felt small and enormous at once. At last, the final borrower climbed the path towards the store, and Ruth stood with Cora on the dock while Eli prepared to cast off. The air had softened. Somewhere behind the store, a hen complained sleepily. The river, which had been green in the morning, now held long bands of amber and pewter, reflecting the low sun and the shadowed bluffs beyond the bend. "They'll talk of this all week," Ruth said. "By your next trip, you may need a bigger boat." "Let us fill this one first," Cora said, but she was smiling. The line was loosed. The boat eased away, and Ruth lifted a hand from the dock until the widening water placed a comfortable distance between them. Cora watched the landing grow smaller. The gray boards, the red clay path, the store porch, the figure of Ruth still standing there in the evening light. Then the river turned, and the first community slipped from sight. Not gone, only held behind the bend until the next visit. Below in the cabin, the shelves looked changed. There were gaps now, small irregular spaces where books had gone out into homes, kitchens, schoolrooms, and lamp-lit corners. Cora sat at the desk beneath the single lamp and opened the log. The boat's engine hummed through the floor. Water whispered along the hull. Above her, Eli steered them into the deepening evening, and outside the windows, the reflected light trembled once more across the ceiling. Dimmer now, slower, like the last movement of the day, settling itself to rest. She wrote the date first. Then Ruth Calloway's landing. Then the number of borrowers, the titles loaned, the names of families to remember, and a note to bring more primers, more farming bulletins, more stories with strong endings and gentle middles. Her pen moved steadily. The page that had been blank that morning was no longer blank. It held proof of arrival, of use, of return promised. Cora paused before closing the book and listened to the river carrying them on through the blue Kentucky dusk. The first day had not been grand. It had been better than grand. It had been ordinary in the way all lasting things must first become ordinary. A boat, a shelf, a a name written down, a book placed into waiting hands, and beyond the next bend, more quiet miles of water leading onward. Cora woke before the sun, not because any bell had rung or any voice had called her, but because the river had been speaking softly all night, and some quieter part of her had learned to listen. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The ceiling above her was low and timbered, with the faintest seam of gray light showing at the edge of the curtain. Then the boat shifted beneath her, not enough to startle, only enough to remind her that the floor was floating, and the day came back to her in pieces. Ruth Calloway's dock, the first names in the log, the gaps on the shelves, the evening river carrying them away from the landing. She lay still and let the boat become familiar around her. Water lapped the hull with a patient, hollow sound. Somewhere aft, a rope creaked against a ring. The air was cold enough to make the blanket welcome, but it carried through the small cabin the clean, damp smell of river morning, mingled now with coffee. That was Eli's doing. He was already awake. Cora smiled into the dimness, knowing this as surely as if she had seen him. Eli, on deck, in his cap, hands wrapped round a tin cup, watching the mist before the engine had properly warmed. Outside, the Kentucky River had gathered the dawn close to itself. Mist sat low on the water, a pale breath drawn along the bends, so that the hills appeared only in layers, first as shadow, then as darker shadow behind it. The trees along the bank were not yet trees, but suggestions, their branches beaded with moisture, their trunks disappearing where the white air touched the water. When Cora stepped onto the deck with her cardigan buttoned over her dress, the world seemed made of quiet beginnings. The engine idled softly, not yet urging them forward. Coffee steamed in the small pot, and Eli handed her a cup without comment. They ate bread with butter and apple preserves from a jar Ruth had sent down to the boat the evening before, though Cora had not noticed it being given. Eli balanced his plate on his knee, gazing out over the blank silver water. Between them, there was the ease of people who did not need to fill every space. As children, they had sat in just such silences, beside creeks, on fence rails, in the corner of a kitchen, while rain ticked at the windows. Now, the silence had widened, becoming river-wide, hill-wide, touched by the low calling of birds beginning to stir in the willows. By the time the sun had risen high enough to turn the mist gold at its upper edges, they were moving again. The second landing lay only a few miles downstream, a smaller place than Ruth's, little more than a shelf of bank below scattered cabins, with no store to gather people, and no Ruth Calloway to put out word with certainty. Eli brought the boat in gently, reducing the engine to a murmur. 2 dogs appeared first, then a boy, barefoot despite the chill, and then a man in a dark coat who stood at the top of the bank with his hands in his pockets, considering the boat as though it were a question he did not yet mean to answer. Cora did not hurry. She had learned something the day before, and the river had confirmed it in the night. A thing offered too quickly could feel like a demand. She opened the cabin door, straightened the lower shelf, and waited where she could be seen. One woman came down after several minutes, wiping her hands on her apron, and asked whether the books cost anything. When Cora answered that they did not, and that they were only to be borrowed and returned when the boat came round again, the woman nodded without smiling, then stepped inside. The choices made at that landing were different. Fewer novels left the shelves. The Bible was asked for first, by a young wife who said her mother's copy had lost the book of Luke and half of Acts. 2 almanacs went next, and a pamphlet on milk cows, and a medical guide so carefully handled by an elderly man that Cora found herself watching his fingers rather than his face. They were large hands, knotted at the joints, with nails darkened from soil and work. But he turned the pages as if each one had weight and value. He could read slowly, he told her, if the print was not too small. Cora found him a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles from a donated case Ruth had pressed on her, and held the page nearer the window. He bent over the book, sounded out the first line under his breath, and smiled, not at Cora, but at the words themselves. That smile stayed with her after they left. The landing receded more quietly than Ruth's had done. No one waved for long, and yet 3 children stood on the bank until the boat rounded the bend, the youngest clutching a primer against her chest with both arms. Cora entered the loans in the log, while Eli steered through a long green corridor of water. Bible, almanac, medical guide, primer, dairy pamphlet, seed catalog. She saw, in the line of titles, the shape of daily life: faith, weather, illness, children, animals, planting. It was a catalog, but it was also a map of need. The river widened as the morning stretched towards noon. Limestone bluffs rose on the bends, their faces streaked with moisture and shaded in grays, creams, and soft moss green. In places, they stood almost sheer above the water, and the boat passed beneath them with its engine note deepened by echo. Eli told Cora that the Kentucky River ran for more than 250 miles before it reached the Ohio, and that long before the rails and roads had made their promises, the river had carried much of what the country could not carry overland. Timber had floated down it, and coal, and tobacco, and barrels, and mail, and travelers who trusted water better than mud. He spoke of the locks and dams built through the previous century. Stone and timber, and later concrete, meant to quiet the river into steps so that boats could pass where once shallows and snags had ruled. Some had been made before the Civil War, others much later, and by the time the whole slackwater system was finished, the world was already leaning towards railways. Still, the river remembered. At certain bends, Eli said, old men could name packet boats as if they were neighbors. And near the locks, there were families who had lived by water levels, gates, and seasons for as long as anyone could recall. Cora listened, with the log open on her knees. A kingfisher crossed ahead of them, blue flashing once above the water before it vanished into a sycamore. Redbud trees had begun to bloom along the banks, not fully yet, but enough to put a purple haze among the grays and browns. The sound of the river against the hull was steady and inward turning, as if the boat were being rocked by a long, slow breath. It made reading easy, and thinking easier. She noted the books requested, then added in the margin, more large print if possible. Spectacles useful. Bring seed and livestock bulletins. Readers not to be hurried. In the middle of the afternoon, Eli slowed the engine. Ahead, between river willows, a narrow path climbed the bank so discreetly that Cora might have missed it had he not pointed. At the top stood a small weathered house with a tin roof and a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs. One chair held a folded quilt. The other stood empty, its seat gray with dust, and the sight of it told Cora something before anyone spoke. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, straight line. The smell of wood smoke reached them first, and then, as they tied up, the warm scent of something baking. The woman who came to the porch was small and upright, with white hair pinned close and sleeves rolled over work-worn forearms. Her name was Mrs. Elspeth Riddle, and she had heard of the library boat from a nephew who had passed Ruth's Landing 2 Sundays before. She had been watching the river since breakfast, she said, and had nearly put the kettle on 3 times so it would be ready at the right moment. "Then I hope we are not late," Cora said. "No," Mrs. Riddle replied. "A boat is never late if it comes by river. It comes when the water allows." The visit lasted longer than planned. Cora brought a basket of books up the path, and Mrs. Riddle set tea, cornbread, and a dish of preserved peaches on the small table by the window. She had lived in the house for 46 years. Her husband had been gone for 9. Her children had moved west, one to Louisville and one beyond the state altogether. And though letters came, they came irregularly, being dependent upon weather, roads, and the memory of men carrying mail bags through more than one settlement. She did not speak of loneliness directly. Instead, she asked for a book with gardens in it, because the lower patch took shade sooner than it used to. A volume of poems, because her husband had liked being read to after supper. And a novel with a family in it, though not one, she said, where people shouted too much. Cora laid out the choices on the table. Mrs. Riddle's hands moved over them slowly, fingertips resting on each cover before she decided. She chose a gardening bulletin, a slim book of poems, the Gospel of John in large print, and a novel whose first page began with a woman opening a door to spring weather. Each selection seemed less like taking than remembering. When Cora wrote her name in the log, Mrs. Riddle watched the pen closely, as if her own presence on the page pleased her. Before they left, she wrapped 2 small loaves in cloth and pressed them into Cora's hands for the night. Evening came softly. They moored at a quiet bank where the river curved beneath darkening hills and no roof showed between the trees. Eli set the line round a leaning sycamore, and the boat settled with its nose towards the current. There was no landing, no porch, no waiting borrowers. Only the slow movement of water, the last birds working the branches, and the sky opening from pale blue into lavender. They ate Mrs. Riddle's bread on the little deck, with beans warmed in a pan and coffee gone strong from sitting too long. "What has surprised you?" Eli asked after a while. Cora considered. Across the river, a whippoorwill called once, then again, its voice carrying from the far bank in a pattern that seemed to belong to the dusk itself. The lamp inside the cabin cast a warm rectangle across the water, trembling gold over black. "How little people ask for foolishly," she said. "I thought I would be choosing stories, and I am. But mostly people ask for what will help them mend a roof, raise a child, keep a cow well, read a psalm without stumbling, or understand a place they have never seen." Eli nodded. "A book is a tool, depending who's holding it. And sometimes company," Cora said, thinking of Mrs. Riddle's unused chair. The night deepened around them. The river sounded fuller after dark, less like water passing, and more like water arriving, gathering every small noise from the banks and carrying it close. Frogs called from a muddy inlet. Leaves shifted, though there was hardly any wind. The hills became a single dark shape against a sky pricked with early stars. Cora sat until the cold reached through her skirt, then went below and slept, with the sense that the river was not beneath her now, but beside her, keeping watch. Morning brought the largest landing yet. It appeared round a bend in stages. First chimney smoke, then a church steeple, then the squared roofs of a proper river town gathered above a long dock. A man in a waistcoat waited with a clipboard, and beside him stood several women with baskets, children in clean collars, 2 teachers, a storekeeper, and a line of people stretching back towards the road. Word had traveled ahead of the boat. Someone had made the visit into an event. Cora felt no tightening beneath her ribs this time. She greeted the organizer, Mr. Talbert from the general store, accepted his careful list of families, and opened the cabin with the quiet authority of someone who had learned the shape of her work by doing it. More than once, she had to ask people to wait on the dock until there was room, but she did so with such steadiness that no one objected. The boat became a small, moving public room, its shelves visited by hands smelling of flour, tobacco, soap, engine grease, and cold morning air. Here the full range of hunger for print revealed itself. A school teacher asked for primers and any maps, however old. A farmer wanted information on orchard blight. 2 boys asked shyly whether there were adventures set in the West, and Cora found them a Zane Grey novel with a cracked spine and pages soft as cloth. Several women looked through magazines for dress patterns, recipes, and news of fashions that might never be copied exactly, but could still brighten an afternoon's imagining. The Bible was requested again and again, sometimes for reading, sometimes for teaching letters, sometimes simply because a household without one felt incomplete. By then, Cora understood that the pack-horse library, whether carried by mule through mountain weather or floated by boat along river bends, was more than a charity of books. It was employment for women who knew the country. It was a thread between settlements. It was evidence that a place could be distant without being forgotten. In counties where adult reading had often been hard-won, where many schools owned only a few battered texts, a borrowed book could alter the sound of an evening. A child might read aloud at the table. A father might spell his way through a farm notice. A mother might copy a recipe or a remedy into a notebook kept near the stove. A story might move through 3 houses before returning home. When the crowd thinned at last, the shelves were in bright disorder. Cora spent the next stretch of river putting them right again. She mended a torn page with paste, set worn magazines aside for scrapbooks, and rearranged the remaining novels so their titles could be seen. There were more kinds of books aboard than any casual glance suggested. Robinson Crusoe, seed catalogs, hymnals, poultry circulars, a grammar book, household medicine, poetry, sermons, popular westerns, children's stories, a geography with colored maps, and odd volumes of history donated by people whose names had been lost, but whose gifts were still traveling. The catalog had begun to feel alive to her. Its columns were orderly, But what they held was not. They held a boy's wish to understand engines, an old man's patience with large print, Mrs. Riddle's memory of being read to, a school teacher's hope for maps, a farmer's worry over blight. Cora ran her finger down the entries and felt that each line was a doorway opened briefly onto a room she had been trusted to enter. She had read some of the books she carried and meant to read others when the route allowed. But increasingly, she felt that the books belonged first to those who needed them next. The message came at a narrow landing where only 2 borrowers waited. It was folded into an envelope softened by handling, addressed to Cora Baines in a firm hand, and passed to her by a boy who said it had come from the county office with the mail. She opened it after they had pulled away, standing in the cabin while the river light moved over the page. The water route would end at the next major landing. Beyond that, the communities on her list lay up creeks and over ridges where no boat could follow. A horse would be waiting there for her, a mare called Bessie, steady on rough paths and already accustomed to library packs. Cora read the distances twice. 12 miles one day, 18 another. Shorter stretches where the grade was steep, longer where the path held to a creek. There were notes about fords, about a ridge that should not be attempted after heavy rain, about a schoolhouse that served as a distributing center for families farther in. The names of mountain settlements had a different sound from the river landings, as if the words themselves had climbed. She felt the small inner shift of a person who has been living by one element and is about to trust another. The river had carried her. Soon the hills would ask her to carry herself. The final river landing appeared 2 mornings later, larger than any they had yet visited, with a proper dock, warehouses, a school, and houses stepping back from the water into new grass. They stayed 2 nights. Borrowed books returned in bundles tied with string, in flour sacks, in the arms of children who seemed reluctant to let them go until another was promised. New books went out as quickly as Cora could record them. People came from farther away than usual, arriving by wagon, on foot, and 1 or 2 by mule, their animals tied patiently near the store, while conversation moved across the dock like mild weather. On the second afternoon, Cora looked up from the log and saw Ruth Calloway standing at the edge of the crowd, a basket over one arm and that same capable brightness in her face. She had traveled down with a neighbor, she said, partly on business, partly because she wanted to see how the boat looked after being properly used. Ruth stepped aboard, looked at the gaps, the mended corners, the busy desk, and nodded as if confirming something she had known from the start. "You filled it," she said. "And emptied it," Cora replied, "and filled it again." They sat together for a little while on the dock, while the sun lowered, and the last borrowers chose their books. Ruth had brought biscuits, apples, and a packet of needles wrapped in paper, because a woman going into the mountains should never be without needles. Their farewell was unhurried. Ruth did not make a speech. She only took Cora's hand between both of hers and told her that listening was half the work, and that she had that part already. Cora thanked her and found that the words were smaller than what she meant. By morning, Cora's bags were packed. They were heavier than when she had first come aboard, not only with clothing, cards, and supplies, but with gifts pressed upon her for the road. Bread wrapped in cloth, dried apples, a tin of salve, the needles from Ruth, and a small packet of seed from Mrs. Riddle's garden, sent along by a neighbor who had passed her house. Bessie was not yet in sight, but the stableman had promised to bring her to the top of the bank. Eli checked the straps twice, then checked them again, because leaving gave his hands something to do. The spring morning had that clear, expectant quality in which every edge seems newly made. The dock boards drying after dew, the grass bright along the path, the river holding a pale reflection of sky. Cora stood with her bag on her shoulder and her satchel across her body. Eli lifted the remaining pack as if it weighed nothing, though she knew it did. "You'll write when you can," he said. "I will. And you'll trust the mare more than your map if the two disagree." "I will trust both in their proper order." He smiled at that, then set the pack down at the foot of the path. Their farewell was brief, because neither of them cared to make it otherwise. Eli kissed her cheek, looked once towards the rising road, and said, "Go on then." Cora began to climb. The path up the bank was worn earth, with new grass at the edges and small stones pressing through the clay. She did not look back at once. The satchel knocked softly against her hip. Behind her, below her, the boat rested at the dock, its shelves altered by every hand that had reached for them, its little sign catching the morning light. Only when she reached the top did she turn. Eli stood on the deck with one hand raised. The river moved behind him, broad and calm, carrying the memory of landings, mist, lamps, voices, and pages turned in quiet rooms. Cora raised her hand in answer. Then she faced forward again. Ahead, the path left the river and entered the hills, where the first mountain miles waited in the clear spring air. And she walked towards them with the peaceful certainty of someone who had been brought this far by water and was ready now to follow the road upward. At the top of the bank, where the river path gave itself over to grass and then to the first rising track between the trees, Harlan Combs was waiting, as if he had been there all morning and had never considered impatience useful. He stood beside a chestnut mare with a gray muzzle and a calm, sideways gaze, one hand resting lightly on her neck. He was tall without seeming large, lean in the way of men who had spent more years walking hills than sitting in rooms. And his face held the weather plainly. Sun at the brow, wind at the cheekbones, fine lines gathered at the corners of his eyes. His hat was old, his coat carefully brushed, and his stillness had nothing vacant in it. He had the look of someone noticing everything without needing to turn his head. "Miss Baines," he said, lifting his hat by the brim. "Mr. Coombs." His smile was small but warm. "Harlan will do, if we're to be on a path together. Then Cora will do as well." The introduction was brief, but it felt complete. Cora understood at once that Harlan was not a man who would explain himself at length. Whatever he knew would come in its proper place, like a spring emerging from rock, only where the ground allowed it. Behind him, the river glimmered below, already lower than it had seemed from the dock, and ahead of him, the path narrowed between young pawpaw, beech, and oak. The mare breathed steadily into the cool morning. Her saddle was plain and well kept, and across it lay the 2 leather bags that would carry the library into the hills. "This is Bessie," Harlan said. "She knows more of these roads than I do, though she will not always admit it." Bessie turned one ear, as if the remark had been acknowledged and set aside. She was sturdy rather than graceful, with strong shoulders, a dark mane rubbed unevenly by harness, and a patient lower lip that gave her an air of private judgment. Cora approached her slowly, letting the mare see her hand before touching the warm place just below the neck strap. Bessie smelled of hay, leather, clean animal warmth, and the faint iron scent of the bit. Her breath showed for an instant in the morning air, then vanished. She did not shift away. She only looked past Cora towards the path, as though the matter of companionship had already been settled. Harlan checked the saddlebags with the careful habit of someone who respected both books and horses. The weight had been divided evenly. Primers, a Bible, 2 almanacs, magazines, newspapers folded flat, a medical guide wrapped in oilcloth, a handful of novels, a gardening pamphlet, a book of poems, and several homemade scrapbooks stitched from clippings. They were the sort of things the mountain librarians had carried for years by then. Not always new, not always handsome, but made useful by hands that mended torn pages and pasted recipes, sewing patterns, current events, and household advice into anything that could survive a route. Across eastern Kentucky, women had ridden such loads through weather and creek water, sometimes 100 miles or more in a week, because some houses could be reached no other way. When everything was tightened, Harlan gave Bessie's shoulder one quiet pat, and they began. The change from river to mountain happened almost at once. Behind them, the open light above the water widened and shone. Ahead, the trees gathered it into green pieces. The path rose from the bank in a long earthen seam, rutted where rain had run, softened at the edges by new grass and the first white stars of bloodroot. With every step, the sound of the river loosened its hold. First, it was a full murmur, then a lower rushing through branches, then only a brightness somewhere behind them. In its place came birdsong, the creak of leather, the slow, reliable placing of Bessie's hooves, and the small shift of books in the saddlebags as her body found the climb. The air cooled as they rose. It had a different freshness from the river, less open and more rooted, carrying damp earth, leaf mold, wild onion bruised along the path edges, and the clean mineral smell of water traveling hidden through stone. The Kentucky hills were not high in the manner of western ranges, but they were old, folded, and worn down by ages of weather until their slopes had become intimate rather than grand. In this eastern country, part of the Cumberland Plateau, streams had cut long hollows and narrow valleys into sandstone, shale, and coal-bearing rock, leaving ridges that seemed, from a distance, to roll softly one into another. Up close, each mile required attention. Cora learned the mountain pace by surrendering to it. On the river, movement had been continuous even when she stood still. Here, progress came by footfall, breath, and grade. Harlan walked beside Bessie's head on the narrow places, and behind her on the easier stretches, saying little at first. When they reached the first creek crossing, Bessie stopped without instruction, lowered her head, considered the stones, and chose her own line through the clear, cold water. The bags shifted once, then steadied. Harlan did not interfere. "Best to let her think she thought of it," he said. After that, words came more readily, though still without hurry. Harlan had taught school in these mountains for 40 years, first in a one-room building where every age sat under the same roof, and the youngest learned letters, while the oldest worked sums by the stove. He knew who had walked 5 miles to class barefoot in summer, who had learned late but remembered everything, who could mend a plow, recite a ballad, read a weather sign, or keep 3 younger children quiet while a mother worked in the field. His knowledge was not gossip. It was a map made of kinship, need, pride, sorrow, skill, and habit. He knew which families would welcome a stranger at once, and which needed the stranger to stand still long enough to become less strange. Cora listened more than she spoke. The river had taught her to notice landings. Harlan was teaching her to notice thresholds. He pointed out paths invisible to her until he named them. A chimney through trees, a schoolhouse roof below a ridge, a footlog darkened by spray, a spring where water rose from under laurel roots. He told her where the clay held after rain, where a horse should be led rather than ridden, where an old woman lived who liked newspapers but not novels, and where a family with 6 children would keep any primer until the cover gave way, unless reminded gently that others waited. The first mountain community lay below them in a hollow, more scattered than any river landing. There was no dock, no store porch, no single place to gather. 3 houses stood within calling distance of one another, with sheds, wood piles, gardens newly turned, and chickens moving like bits of brown leaf through the yard. Smoke rose straight from one chimney and sideways from another where the draft was poorer. Harlan called from the path before descending, his voice carrying without force. Doors opened, faces appeared. Because he was known, Cora did not arrive as an intrusion, but as something entrusted to him. The books were received quietly, almost solemnly. No one crowded the saddlebags. A mother washed her hands before touching a reader. A boy of perhaps 12 asked for a newspaper, saying his father liked to hear about Frankfurt, even when Frankfurt had nothing to do with them. A child too young to read chose a picture book and held it flat on both palms, careful not to bend it, while her older sister promised to tell her every word. Cora knelt beside them on the packed earth and showed how the card worked, writing names in the log balanced on her knee. The hollow was full of small sounds. A baby stirring indoors, a hoe striking a stone in the garden, Bessie cropping grass, the creek running somewhere below the alders. When they climbed again after the visit, the day had warmed. They reached a high path near midday and stopped where the ground widened beneath 2 oaks still bare at the tips. Below them, the hollow they had left seemed cupped in the hills, its smoke no more than pale threads. Farther off, beyond ridge after ridge, the river showed for a moment as a silver line, so distant that Cora felt she might have imagined it. Around them, spring had taken fuller hold. Redbud bloomed deep pink against gray-brown oak woods. Dogwood was beginning to open, its pale bracts hovering like small lamps among the branches. At the path edges grew trillium, bloodroot, and the first hepatica, delicate as if made for no purpose but to reward anyone traveling slowly enough to see them. They ate bread, dried apples, and a little cheese, while Bessie grazed with steady concentration. Harlan looked over the country without possession or surprise. "These mountains are old," he said, "old enough to have forgotten being sharp. Folks think that means they are easy." He broke a piece of bread and smiled faintly. "They are not easy. They are familiar, if you let them become so." Cora looked at the folds of land and understood something of what he meant. The mountains did not announce themselves. They enclosed, concealed, revealed by degrees. Their stillness differed from the rivers. The river had carried sound along its surface. Here, sound gathered in hollows and softened among trunks. Even the light had changed. It came filtered through leaves and branches, green-edged, broken, close to the skin. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, and the silence was complete without being empty. In the afternoon, Harlan's manner altered almost imperceptibly as the path turned downward. "Next is May Sturgill's Hollow," he said. "She will decide for herself whether she wants us." He said no more, and Cora did not ask. The descent was steep, following a creek that ran clear and cold over dark stones. Laurel crowded the banks. The smell of the hollow rose to meet them. Creek water, wood smoke, turned earth, and something green beginning under last year's leaves. May's house stood on a small flat above the creek, weathered but well kept, with a straight wood pile, a fenced kitchen garden already planted in careful rows, and shirts drying on a line between two posts. Two children watched from a window and vanished when they saw they had been seen. May Sturgill was on the porch, arms folded, still as a post. She was not old, though work and weather had placed seriousness in her face. Her hair was tied back with a strip of cloth, and her sleeves were rolled above strong wrists. Nothing about the place was careless. A hoe leaned clean against the fence. Kindling was stacked under cover. The garden beds had been turned deeply and evenly. Here was a life managed alone, with competence so complete that it made any offer of help seem, at first, an impertinence. Harlan introduced Cora in few words. May nodded, polite but guarded. She asked how often the route would come. She asked whether books were to be paid for if damaged. She asked whether children's books had to be returned sooner than others. Her voice was level, practical, closed around itself. Cora answered each question simply. Then, almost without deciding, she reached into the saddlebag and drew out the book of poems Mrs. Riddle had not taken after all. The one with a faded blue cover and a pressed violet discovered between its pages that morning when Cora had checked it. May's expression changed so slightly that Cora might have missed it had she not been watching. The guardedness did not disappear. It loosened by one notch. Her eyes went to the book, then to Cora's hand, then back to the cover. "My mother had one like that," May said. Harlan, with tact learned over decades, took Bessie down to the creek and made a long business of loosening a strap. Cora and May sat on the porch steps. The boards were warm from the afternoon sun. The children returned to the window, then to the doorway, then to the edge of the porch, drawn by curiosity as much as by permission. May opened the book carefully. When she spoke of reading, her voice changed entirely. It softened, not in weakness, but in use, as if some inner room had been opened and aired. Her mother had known ballads, she said, and Bible verses, and stories that had crossed the ocean before anyone in the family could say from where. In the mountains, words had always traveled by mouth, from porch to hearth, from harvest to winter evening. A printed page did not replace that. It gave another way for a story to stay. They talked while the light moved across the hollow. May asked what other books came in the bags, and Cora laid them out. The Bible, primers, newspapers, a magazine with recipes and mechanical drawings, a western, a household guide, a scrapbook of canning advice, another of quilt patterns. May touched the scrapbooks with interest. They were not fine things. Some pages had been cut unevenly. Some clippings overlapped. The paste showed in places. But they held what people had thought worth saving, and that gave them a homeliness more durable than polish. "You'll stay for supper," May said at last, as if stating the next sensible fact. They stayed. The table inside was covered with oilcloth, its pattern faded by wiping. The chairs did not match, and the lamp in the center had been cleaned until the chimney shone. Supper was cornbread, beans, greens, and peaches preserved from the previous autumn. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was wanting. The children, a boy and a younger girl, watched Cora with open interest until May gave them small tasks, and then their shyness settled into usefulness. Harlan spoke little, but when he did, the children listened, as children listen to someone whose stories they have trusted before. After supper, May lit the lamp properly and opened the blue book. Cora and Harlan sat on the porch, while the children drew close inside. The door remained open. May began to read, and her voice carried out into the hollow, low and sure, finding the rhythm of the lines without display. The creek went on speaking below the house. Bessie shifted once in the yard, then settled. Beyond the garden, the dark came up slowly from the ground, gathering first under the trees, then along the fence, then beneath the porch steps. Cora listened with her hands folded in her lap and felt no wish to add anything to the moment. The book had crossed water and hill to reach this room, but now it belonged to the sound of May's voice and the stillness of her children. They slept that night under May's roof, Cora in a small room, smelling faintly of soap and stored quilts. Harlan on a pallet near the kitchen stove. In the morning, the hollow was cool and blue before sunrise. Mist lay along the creek, and the garden rows were dark with dew. Harlan was already preparing to return to the river landing. He tightened Bessie's girth, checked the bags, and gave Cora the route sheet folded smaller than before, marked now with his own pencil lines. At the fork after Mill Creek, take the upper path if the sky stays clear, he said. If rain comes, take the lower, even if it adds miles. The upper turns mean after wet weather. Bessie knows, but you should know why she knows. That was his farewell to her. Practical, precise, generous in its own fashion. He shook Cora's hand, then turned to Bessie and put both palms briefly against the mare's face, speaking to her too softly for Cora to hear. Bessie breathed into his sleeve. It was the most open affection he had shown all morning, and Cora liked him for it. May stood on the porch with the blue book held against her apron. The children hovered behind her, no longer hidden. Harlan lifted his hand once and started down the creek path, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man returning through country that had known him almost all his life. Cora watched until the laurel and young leaves took him piece by piece. Coat, hat, shoulder, hand. Then there was only the path, damp and pale, where his boots had passed. For a little while, nothing moved except the creek and Bessie's ears. The saddlebags were full, balanced, and ready. The morning air was clear enough to make every sound distinct. Water over stone, a rooster far off, May closing the house door gently behind her. Cora stood beside Bessie and looked towards the path climbing out of the hollow. It was hers now, not because she knew every turn, but because she had begun to understand how to meet it. Slowly, attentively, without assuming the way would show itself all at once. She laid a hand on Bessie's warm neck. The mare stepped forward, steady and entirely untroubled. And together, they began the first mountain mile that belonged wholly to them. The first morning alone on the mountain route did not feel lonely. It was too clear for that, too full of small, exact things. The hollow lay cool and blue behind Cora as she tightened the last strap on Bessie's saddle and looked once more at the open log balanced on the fence rail. May had already gone inside to wake the children, and the house gave off the faint household sounds of water poured, stove iron touched, a chair moved across boards. Beyond the garden, the path rose through laurel and young leaf into a brightness the sun had not yet reached. Bessie stood with the untroubled patience of one who knew that people often needed time before doing what horses had understood from the start. Cora checked the saddlebags because checking them was now part of the morning. The Bible and primers lay to the left, wrapped against damp. The newspapers and magazines were flat beneath a cloth. The scrapbooks sat together, their uneven edges familiar beneath her hand. She knew the weight of the bags now, knew the small pull they gave when Bessie turned, knew how much room to leave for returns and for the food people would insist upon pressing on her at doors. She wrote one line before closing the log. May Sturgill's Hollow. Morning clear. Route begins alone, though not without company. Then she set the book in her satchel, laid a hand on Bessie's neck, and they started upward without ceremony. The mountains received her in the manner of mountains, which was to make no announcement at all. They did not welcome her with grandeur or resist her with drama. They simply held the path. The cool air before the hollows warmed, the dampness under leaves, the birds beginning one by one in the canopy. Bessie's hooves sounded steady on the packed earth, then hollow over roots, then softer where old leaves lay in a drift. The river was no longer audible. In its place was a nearer world. A wren scolding from a thicket, water moving below stone, the leather creak of the saddlebags, and Cora's own breathing settling to the climb. The days that followed found their pattern as naturally as water finds a creek bed. Cora rose early wherever she had been given a place to sleep, a spare room smelling of quilts and soap, a loft above clean hay, a corner near a kitchen stove where coals kept a red eye through the night. She washed at a basin or in cold creek water, packed her things by lamplight, and set out before the sun had reached the lower gardens. Bessie chose her footing at crossings, never hurrying, never doubting. Sometimes she paused at a fork Cora had nearly missed, and waited until the right path became obvious. Sometimes she stopped for no reason Cora could see, then flicked an ear towards a loose stone, a slick root, a branch at shoulder height. Cora learned to thank her without words. Each community had its own approach. One announced itself by woodsmoke rising from a hollow before the roofs appeared. Another by the sound of children reciting lessons in a schoolhouse whose windows had been propped open with sticks. Another by dogs barking from 3 ridges at once, sending the news of her arrival ahead of her faster than any bell could have done. At first, she consulted Harlan's pencil marks often, but by the second week, the root had begun to live in her body. She knew where the upper path turned mean after rain, where the lower way added 2 miles but spared Bessie's knees, where the laurel opened just enough to show a chimney, and where the creek stones were trustworthy if the water ran clear. The faces changed too. People who had watched from doorways now came to meet her at the gate. A mother who had once washed her hands twice before touching a book now laughed softly and admitted she had kept the magazine an extra evening so her sister could copy a recipe. The boy who had asked for a newspaper brought it back folded with care and requested another, any date at all, if it had state news. The small child who had once held a picture book flat on both palms had learnt to sound out the first page, pressing a finger beneath each word while her older sister stood by, proud and impatient in equal measure. Books began to move through the hollows, not as strangers, but as visiting kin, borrowed, read aloud, discussed, carried to a neighbor, returned with a pressed leaf or a scrap of paper tucked inside to mark a place. In the evenings, when the day's last voices had settled and Bessie had been fed, Cora opened the log. Its pages had altered since the first morning on the river. Her earliest entries had been neat, almost formal. Names, titles, dates, numbers. Now the lines still held all that, but around them had grown a finer record. At Mill Creek, 3 primers returned, 1 repaired with flour paste, acceptable. Mrs. Naylor requests more about poultry and less about presidents. At Pine Fork, Ezra read aloud without being asked. His mother looked away so as not to trouble him with praise. At May Sturgill's, Blue Poetry Book renewed. Children now know the first piece by heart. May says a book is like a borrowed window if the view is worth keeping. The log was a ledger, but not only that. Across eastern Kentucky, women carrying books by horse, mule, boat, and foot kept such records. Because the program required accounts of miles covered, families served, and volumes loaned. Yet those lists, made in pencil and ink by tired hands at the end of long days, held more than administration. They preserved the shape of rural life in a difficult decade. Who wanted a Bible? Who needed a farm circular? Who asked for medical guidance? Who treasured a magazine? Who wanted stories of western deserts or far oceans? Because the mountains were loved, but not the whole of imagining. The Packhorse Library would not last forever. Federal funding would one day end, as all such public works eventually met their season. But for those years, and for those pages, the roots were written into being every time a name was entered. Late in May, on a morning washed clean by rain in the night, the path climbed higher than usual. It wound through woods grown full now with leaf, oak and tulip poplar closing overhead, fern uncurling in the damp shade. the last spring wildflowers giving way to thicker summer green. Then, almost without warning, the trees thinned. The path broke onto an open ridge where the sky widened so suddenly that Cora drew in breath and held it. The whole country seemed gathered below. Ridge after ridge moved away into blue distance, each one softer than the last, with hollows lying deep and green between them. To the west, far below and almost beyond belief, the river shone as a silver thread. Not a road now, but a memory of water. The air at that height was clean and cool. The sky above had the clear late spring blue that appears to have no bottom, only depth upon depth. And for a long while there was no sound except the faint cropping of Bessie's teeth at the path edge and the small settling of leather as she shifted her weight. Cora did not think of Lexington, or of the first morning at the dock, or even of the miles yet to be walked. She was simply there. The saddlebags were full of books waiting to be delivered. The mare beside her was warm and steady. The hills below held houses she could now find by smoke, by creek, by turn of path, by the memory of a child's face at a doorway. A red-tailed hawk rode a thermal below the ridge, so that for the first time Cora looked down upon a bird in flight. It circled without effort, borne by air she could not see, then slipped towards the next hollow and vanished. The silence that remained was complete, clean, and without weight. She stayed until Bessie, having found all the grass of interest, turned her head and regarded Cora with mild enquiry. Then they descended towards May's Hollow. By then, the path was familiar enough that every bend carried a small anticipation. The redbud had finished. The hollow was deep green with full leaf. The creek ran lower than it had in early spring, clearer and quieter over its stones. Beans climbed poles in May's garden. Lettuces made pale ruffled rows near the fence, and the woodpile had somehow become straighter than before. May was already outside when Cora came into sight. "Heard Bessie above the creek," she said, as if this explained everything. The warmth between them no longer needed careful tending. It had become like the path to the porch, known, used, strong, because feet had passed that way often enough. May returned the blue book, though not before telling Cora which poems were worth the trouble, and which, in her opinion, used too many words to say a small thing. She took a newspaper, a reader for the younger child, a farm bulletin on beans, and a novel Cora had chosen because its heroine kept a household together without ever claiming to be heroic. The boy showed Cora where he had planted Mrs. Riddle's seed beside the fence. The younger child brought out the picture book and read the first page in a whisper, so earnest that even May stood still to hear it. Later, when the practical business was done, Cora and May sat on the porch while the afternoon moved gold across the hollow. The children were in the garden. Bessie stood by the creek with one hind foot resting, entirely untroubled by friendship, literature, or beans. The two women spoke of books first, because books had made the bridge between them, and then of other things. The way weather could change a plan without asking, the usefulness of a good needle, the difficulty of keeping children in shoes, the possibility that the boy might walk to the schoolhouse on the ridge in autumn if the path held. "Reading has not changed the work," May said, looking out towards the garden. "Beans still want hoeing, wood still wants cutting, children still want feeding, even when they have just been fed. But it changes the room around the work, makes it bigger." Cora listened, and knew better than to improve upon the truth of it. Birdsong thinned as evening approached. The creek went on with its small, clear speech. Light rested on the porch boards, on May's hands folded in her lap, on the spines of the books between them. In the mountains of Kentucky, where stories had long lived in memory and voice, the written page was not an interruption, but another vessel. It came into houses already rich with telling, and found its place beside the hearth. The hymn, the family tale, the weather sign, the child asking for one more page. The final circuit unfolded without haste. Cora visited the last few hollows on her list, collecting returns, renewing what could be renewed, promising certain titles for the next round. Farewells had changed from polite thanks to particular instructions. "Bring more on beekeeping if you can. The western may go to my brother when I have done with it. Mrs. Naylor says no more presidents unless one of them knows chickens." At a schoolhouse, children gathered round Bessie more confidently than they did Cora, which Cora privately considered a sound judgment. At a creek crossing near dusk, Bessie chose the homeward side before Cora had gathered the reins, and the mare's certainty filled her with quiet pleasure. Then, after days of ridge and hollow, the river announced itself before it appeared. It came first as a coolness in the air, then as a scent. Mud, water, willow, and something broad after the close green of the hills. The path descended through trees, crossed a last patch of grass, and opened onto the landing where Cora had said goodbye to Eli. The dock looked the same, weathered boards drying in the late sun, the same rope looped round the same post, the same slope of bank where new grass had thickened since spring began. Yet Cora did not feel that she had returned unchanged to an unchanged place. The river was familiar, and she was familiar to herself in a new way. Ruth Calloway was waiting near the store, of course. She had a coffee pot in one hand and a folded paper in the other. "You look road-worn," Ruth said, "which is better than looking lost." "I feel neither," Cora replied, and found it true. The boat had been and gone 2 days earlier. Eli had left the note with Ruth, folded once and marked with Cora's name. She opened it while Bessie drank from a trough. All well, boat useful, shelves still holding. Don't let the mare bully you unless she is right. E. Cora laughed softly, then folded the note again and put it into the log between pages already thick with names. That evening, Ruth's store filled as though drawn by lamplight. The general store had always been more than a place of buying and selling. In such communities, it held news before newspapers reached every house, messages before telephones, opinions, remedies, weather predictions, gossip, comfort, and the ordinary business of being known. Now it held books as well. Coffee steamed near the stove. The air smelt of dry goods, wood smoke, lamp oil, old paper, and Ruth's biscuits warming under a cloth. People came in ones and twos, then in clusters, bringing returned volumes wrapped carefully against dust, and asking after titles that had gone on to the mountains and might come back by another road. Cora moved through them easily. She knew when to recommend and when to wait, when to write a name at once, and when to let a reader hold a book a little longer before deciding. Ruth watched from behind the counter with quiet satisfaction, making change, pouring coffee, correcting a child who leaned on a flour sack, and sending a man back outside to wipe his boots properly before he came near the lower shelf. The gathering had none of the excitement of the first day, and that was its beauty. It was no longer a novelty. It was something worth keeping. At last, the evening thinned. Families left with lanterns swinging low. The screen door closed and opened, then finally rested. Ruth banked the stove and carried cups to the back room. Cora sat at a small table in the corner, where the lamplight fell most kindly, and opened the log for the final entry of her first season. Outside, the river moved below the landing, unseen but steady. Inside, the store settled around her with the small wooden sighs of a building cooling after a day of use. She wrote slowly, not because she lacked words, but because she wanted each one to arrive properly. First circuit complete. River route and mountain route joined. Books returned in good order, except one torn primer, mended on site. Requests for next journey: large print scripture, poultry, beans, maps, westerns, children's readers, household medicine, poetry, if plain spoken. May Sturgill renewed newspaper and took novel. Child at Laurel Hollow read first page aloud. Bessie knows the way home. Communities expect return. Her pen paused, then moved once more. It is not only that books are wanted. It is that their coming makes a road visible between people who have always been here, each in their own hollow, bend, or house, and yet not always within reach. The road may be water, or clay, or creek stone, or a line written in a ledger. It may be a woman walking beside a mare. It may be a neighbor carrying a book onward when the first reader is done. However it is made, it holds. She closed the log and set the pen beside it. For a moment, she rested her hand on the cover. The Packhorse Library would continue beyond this first circuit, beyond this one season, as long as the funding held and the roads, rivers, and women held with it. Across the mountain counties, such routes would carry books until 1943, reaching tens of thousands of people who had once stood beyond the reach of ordinary shelves. But Cora did not think of numbers then. She thought of names, doors, creek crossings, Ruth's hands, Eli's note, May's porch, Bessie's ears turning towards the right path. When she stepped outside, the Kentucky night was warm enough to stand in without a shawl. The store windows glowed behind her. Below the landing, the river sounded in the dark, steady and unhurried, as it had on the morning when everything began. To the east, the mountains rose as deep shapes against a sky beginning to show stars. Somewhere along those ridges, paths waited in leaf shadow. Somewhere in the hollows, books lay on tables, beside beds, near stoves, already becoming part of the evening speech of families. The boat would come again. Bessie would climb again. Ruth would put on coffee. May would read aloud when the work was done. Cora stood between river and mountain, and the world she had chosen held her quietly on both sides. The books were not at rest. They were only waiting for the next journey, the next hand, the next lamp lit in a window at the end of a path. Above the Kentucky hills, the stars brightened one by one. Below, the river kept its slow, dark music. And in that gentle meeting of water, stone, paper, and night, Cora felt herself entirely at home, as if the road had not ended at all, but had simply softened into sleep.